Hi, it's good to be with you again. Today we're going to have a bit of an overview of Ezekiel, the prophet and the book in the Bible. Now, I don't know about you, but Ezekiel, he's the guy I really feel kind of sorry for. I mean, when you read his story, you think, holy smokes, his whole life was uprooted. His job changed entirely. His place of residence changed entirely. And, well, he even was widowed. And it's tough. And, well, it's sad. But at the same time, it's very exciting because God used Ezekiel in this amazing way to help the people in exile to transition to becoming what God wanted them to be and to tell us how God would rescue us inevitably in the future. But everything we know about Ezekiel comes from reading the book in the Bible that bears his name. He's the last of the three major prophets that we're studying. We've already looked at Isaiah and Jeremiah. Ezekiel's the third. And he was, among the Jews, the prophet that was exiled to Babylon in 597 BC. In fact, he didn't receive his call until after his exile. He was married, as I mentioned, and he had his own home. And along with his fellow exiles, he lived in Babylon relatively free. He just wasn't allowed to leave. He was born into a priestly family, and this will determine his orientation and indeed his life, because he was therefore eligible to serve in the temple and to serve as a priest. We will assume that he did so in Jerusalem right up until his captivity. His prophet, Ezekiel, was called to minister to the exiles, to minister to those who found themselves in a foreign land. His message reflects a very unique and intimate knowledge of the workings of the temple and understanding of the holiness of the temple and the holiness of God. Ezekiel was obviously a very well-educated man, not only about his own country, but he seems to have a grasp of international politics, everything from history to shipbuilding to literature. You will find Ezekiel was very well-rounded in his education. And he was so imaginative, and he was such a good communicator. And oh my goodness, you read the stories and how he communicated, how God used his gifts and his wisdom to communicate things to the exiles. And you think, I would have loved to have heard this man talk. Well, we get the blessing of reading his prophecies. More than anyone else and any other prophet, including Hosea and Jeremiah, he was directed to involve himself personally in his prophecies. The messages that he gave from the Lord called upon him to live out, to demonstrate the work that God was doing at times. And it would cause him a tremendous personal cost to do this, but he was faithful. Now, as you know, Ezekiel lived in a time of incredible upheaval. He saw the Assyrian Empire rise and fall. He saw the Egyptian Empire rise and fall. He saw kings ascend and descend and be overthrown from the throne of Israel. He saw puppet kings put into place by the Egyptians, by the Assyrians, by even the Babylonians. And through all that, he remained faithful to God. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, when he sent his force against Jerusalem, and he subdued it in 597 BC. He took captives. He took captives into Babylon, 10,000 Jews, we read in 2 Kings 24. And Ezekiel was one of them. He took the best and the brightest, so we know Ezekiel was considered one of those too. And suddenly, the priest who served in the temple in Jerusalem no longer had a job. He no longer had a place of work. He found himself in a foreign land. The exiles in Babylon were there all the way through August 14th, 586, when the temple was actually finally burned. And they heard about this, and they knew then that the kingdom was utterly conquered, and Jerusalem and the Lord's temple lay in ruins. Since the book of Ezekiel contains more dates than pretty much any other book you're going to read, we can confidently date each prophecy as we come across them. In addition, modern scholarship using archaeology and scientific methods has just confirmed everything that Ezekiel wrote about the dating. So it's a very dependable history of what was going on for the exiles. Now, 12 of the 13 dates tell us when Ezekiel received a divine message. The other is the date of the arrival of the messenger who told the exiles about the fall of Jerusalem. Having received his call in July 593 BC, Ezekiel was active for 22 years, his last stated prophecy being received in April 571 BC. His ministry as a prophet concurs with Jerusalem's darkest hours. It was absolutely at the same time as Jerusalem's darkest hours, preceding the 586 destruction by 7 years and following it by 15. What a time to be a servant of the Lord. In Babylon, Ezekiel, the former priest, received a dramatic and new call from the Lord, and we read about that in Ezekiel chapter 1. Like Isaiah's call, Ezekiel's began with a vision from God, and what a vision it was. I mean, multiple wings and wheels and beast creatures. It's incredible. It feels a little bit like we're reading in Revelation. Hold that thought. But he received during that call a command from God to become a prophet, to take God's message to his people. So for the first 7 years of his ministry, Ezekiel proclaimed something that his fellow exiles definitely did not want to hear. He didn't bring good news to them. In Babylon, you see, the community of exiles was consumed by probably three thoughts. First of all, has God been just to us? Is what happened to us just and fair? What do we do to deserve this? And when can we go back to Jerusalem, the Jerusalem we remember? That's what they were thinking about. Even after receiving the letter from Jeremiah telling them to settle down and build houses and marry and give their children in marriage, they always had in the back of their mind, someday soon we'll be back in Jerusalem. Yes, we will. We know we will, because that's all they could think about. Have you ever known someone who's relocated to a new area, and yet their body is relocated, but their mind never has? Everything's compared. Well, back in this place where I lived, everything was different. It was much better. And they talk about that all the time, and you feel like just saying, why don't you pack up and go back? Well, I imagine that was the attitude of the exiles. They, in fact, even said in Psalm 137, verse 1 to 4, by the rivers of Babylon we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion, Zion being the hill of God, Jerusalem. On the willows by the river we hung our harps, for there our captors asked for songs, our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? And indeed, that is their question. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? We can surmise through the message that we read last week by Jeremiah to the exiles that there were lots of false prophets building up false hopes for an early return to an undamaged Jerusalem, and that the temple would be waiting for them when they returned. But under God's guidance, Ezekiel faithfully relayed to his fellow Jews the disappointing news, but the inevitable news, of God's judgment. Because of all her sins, Jerusalem would fall. We see that all the way through chapters 1 through 24. The fact that Israel was God's covenant people and that Jerusalem was the city of his temple would not bring about their early release from Babylon. It would not keep Jerusalem from being destroyed, because that too is part of God's plan. The only hope the prophet gave his hearers was that of living in peace where they were during their exile. After being informed by the Lord that Jerusalem was under siege and would surely fall in chapter 24, Ezekiel receives news that his wife would die. And it's told to us that just as the people of Israel would mourn the delight of the Lord's eyes, the temple, so our friend Ezekiel was mourn the delight of his eyes, his wife. But he was told to do this mourning in private. He was told to not mourn openly for his wife because God wanted the people not to mourn openly for Jerusalem. Must have been very hard, but this is part of what God used Ezekiel for, to demonstrate through his own life the work that God was doing with people. So after that, Ezekiel is directed to pronounce a series of judgments on the surrounding nations. 7 nations: Ammon, Moab, Philistia, Edom, Tyre, Sidon, Egypt. All those nations that were around Israel, that had tormented Israel, were also going to be judged. Once news was received that Jerusalem had fallen, Ezekiel's prophecies took a new turn. From then on, he would bring a message of hope for his people. They would experience revival. They would experience restoration and a glorious future as a people, as a redeemed and perfected kingdom of God in the world. Ezekiel's prophetic messages are, well, they're similar to the other prophets, but I want you to notice one thing he stresses over and over again as you read. He focuses uniquely on the concept of holiness. He talks about Israel being the holy people of the holy temple, the holy city, the holy land. Israel had taken what God had set apart for holiness, her worship, her temple, her way of living, her ethics, her city, her land, and everything. Israel had taken that and defiled it, made it unclean or unholy. Because of this, a holy God could only withdraw and judge his people with national destruction. But God wasn't done with his people. Because the Lord is faithful to his covenant and his desire to save his people was so great, he promises to revive his people once more, to build something new, to shepherd his people with compassion, to cleanse them of the unholiness or the defilement that they had done, and to rebuild them into a kingdom under the hand of David, as we're told in chapter 34. He even promises to overwhelm all the forces, all the nations that have been against Israel, and to restore the glory of his holy presence in Jerusalem. This all-powerful God was determined that he would be known and acknowledged. Approximately 65 times in the book of Ezekiel, we read some variation of the phrase, "They will know that I am the Lord," or "They will know that I am God." God promises, through his judgments, through the restoration of Israel, that he would become known throughout the entire world. His actions with these covenant people in punishing them and in restoring them would cause him to be known even more widely than he was. What a message of hope this was for people that felt pretty hopeless. The book's central theme is the unfolding of God's saving purpose in the history of this world. From the time in which he must withdraw from the defilement of his covenant people to the culmination of his grand design to restore and revive them and indeed to save them. That plan of salvation would reach fruition through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and then the establishment of his new kingdom on earth. I trust that as you read through Ezekiel, you will see again and again a God who demands holiness and a God who is powerful to and willing to save. Have a good week, ladies. I'll see you next week.